Hi, this is Elizabeth, one of the co-hosts of Beauties and Headcanons. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
This is Rachel Mullins, host of Hashtag No Filter Friday, here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my new show, Hashtag No Filter Friday, where we talk about all of the sexual misconduct allegations swirling around Hollywood. A new show drops every Friday at 8:30 Pacific Standard Time. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you'll never miss an episode of Hashtag No Filter Friday. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. You can check out How to Write Good on the different social media things. This podcast, as always, is brought to you by Public House Media. And is there anything else I need to mention? This is the last podcast of the year. I won't be doing one during the week of Christmas. Taking a day off, a week off, technically. But I won't be doing it then. And I just think you don't need media during the week of Christmas. Just if you celebrate Christmas, be with people you like being with, which isn't your family then, huh? No, be with, celebrate it, go to your family, just take time off, whatever. If you don't celebrate Christmas, then Merry Christmas anyway. But then we're going to go on to the word of the week. The word of the week is mellifluous. And the word of the week, I don't like how this word sounds. I'm not a fan, but I'm a fan of the etymology. So what does mellifluous mean? And I think the reason why I don't like the word is because I have a hard time saying it. It means smoothly, like it's smoothly flowing. It's sweet sounding. So if someone is mellifluous, then they could be sweet sounding. It's more literally, it means to flowing with honey or sweetened as if it's by honey, like something sweetened by honey. But it actually comes from the Latin. This comes pretty much straight from the Latin with very little change. In Latin, honey is meliss, so you can get the beginning part of that. And fluus is flow, which actually is related to the word fluent. And I think it's directly related to our word flow as well. So it's a very, I don't know if meliss is related to some type of bee thing. If you know bees, there's probably a Latin name for them. Melis, mellare, or which sounds like a Harry Potter spell or something like that. But yeah, so that's the word, mellifluous. Now you know what it means. If you run into it, then you know. We're going to move on to our accidental lessons. Man, last week I took so long talking. I think I ate something bad recently, and I'm not feeling super well as I'm recording this, so hopefully I'm not going to have to drop off in the middle and just kind of leave an empty microphone for 25 minutes or so. Okay, so we are going back to my rules for writing, and this one doesn't actually, as I said before, I put the ones that were most important at the beginning, so check those out. And these are getting less and less important. And this one actually falls into. So I complained about other writers saying, other writers were like they gave you rules, but they weren't directly related to writing. And this is the rest of these rules are helpful with your writing, but these are things that are not necessarily just in the writing sphere. These are things that aren't just going to affect the writing sphere. They're going to affect other things as well. So you can kind of take that and you can apply them more broadly. At least I found out you can apply them more broadly. This is rule number 10. So the rule number 10 is take your time. And I don't know. I think people like this because it's not going to take on a rule type thing as much as other ones have. But yeah, so I have had the not privilege. I can't really think of what the word is, but it's a word similar to privilege. I've had the privilege, I suppose, when I'm writing to learn how to write when I was younger and kind of develop a love of writing when I was young, when I didn't have to worry about things. Now, I'm sure most people, this happens to most people, and I think I'm almost certain it does. You do something when you're a kid, and when you're a kid, time is different to you. You don't perceive it the same. You think that everything's going to go on forever, and you have this unlimited amount of time. which you don't, of course, but you experience it like that. And I think kids experience it more, and even teenagers experience it more because they don't have as many responsibilities where they have to value their time. Okay, so it's like, oh, I'm going to do this and this and this, and they don't value their time as much because they don't realize that there's actually going to be a limited amount of it, and more of their time is going to be taken from them throughout their lives, and they're going to have less time for themselves. So I think they don't really care as much. And when you're a kid, this is really good for artistic things. This is really good for developing interests in different areas, because when you come across these interests or come across new things, you don't really care about the time you spend on them. You just kind of spend time on them as you are interested in them or you find them interesting, right? So when you're a kid, you can kind of develop this good feeling around specific things, and you can develop this habit of thinking that directly connects to these different ways of being creative or different ways of doing things. It isn't necessarily with writing. So with writing, for me, I liked writing a lot, so I wrote and I developed a habit of writing. And now when I write, it's easier for me to slip into that habit of writing where I'm just writing and I don't really realize time. I'm just kind of writing and doing my thing. Other people probably do the same thing with like mechanics or something like that, if they really like building stuff, or if they paint or music and different things like that. And there's pretty much everything you can do. If you read The Tipping Point by, what's his name? I can't remember the guy's name. There's a book called The Tipping Point, and it talks about experts. Or is it The Tipping Point that I was talking about? And essentially it's talking about this idea that you take 10,000 hours, or part of it is it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert on everything. I think that's The Tipping Point. I'm pretty sure that's The Tipping Point. There's another book by the same guy, Malcolm Gladwell, I believe his name is. But in it, going back to my point, he talks about Bill Gates. And Bill Gates, when he was a kid, had the privilege of having access to a computer because it was the 70s, I guess. Is he that old? Or is he... I'm not sure how old Bill Gates is. But it was the 70s, I believe, or the late 70s or something like that. And his parents worked somewhere that had access to computers, so he had the ability to have access to a computer, and he really liked coding. So in the same way, this young Bill Gates, who was an adolescent, really enjoyed coding, and I think he had some friends who really enjoyed coding, so they would sneak in the middle of the night, and they would actually code for fun, because that's what you do when you're Bill Gates, and you're, 16 years old, or I think 14, even younger than that. So yeah, when you're younger, it's easier, but maybe you're running into this situation. I run into it more as I get older, and I have to force myself to do things. But especially with creative things, especially with the enjoyment of things, for me, especially with writing, you sit down and just like I talked about last week a little bit, you sit down and you're like, man, this stinks. Like, I don't have as much of a drive to do this, and I feel like don't feel like you're wasting your time, but you have the pressure of life coming on you. And you have the pressure of life all around you, and you're trying to say, oh, well, how do I make room for something I really enjoy? How do I make room for writing? And like I said, you can extend this rule to other things. So if you like music, you can apply this to music. If you like art, if you like working as a mechanic, if you like anything, if you enjoy reading books, I think this is the same. You can actually take this idea and you can apply it there to a certain degree. You can take the principle from it and apply it. And I'll just go into the principle at the end, but not right away. So switching over to writing a little bit more, because if you're listening to this podcast, you're either, I don't know why you're listening to this podcast, but let's go on. So one piece of excellent writing advice that I have gotten was from a book. And the book was really simple. I can't remember the exact name of the book, but it was essentially, the title was essentially, or it was something along the lines of how to write with ease, or how to write without any trouble, or something like that. And I can't remember who the author was, but the book boiled down to a really, really simple thing. It boiled down to a really simple process. And what the process is you take a specific amount of time. So say you start with 5 minutes, and you set a timer, or you make sure you know when the time ends, and you start writing, and you write for those 5 minutes, and when the time, and you write at the same time every day. I believe it was the same time. You write for those 5 minutes, and then when you're done, you stop, whether you want to go on or not. And then as time goes on, every single day, you increase the time you're writing. So instead of writing 5 minutes, you write for a week for 5 minutes a day, then you increase it to 10 minutes, then you increase it to 20, etc., and so on. And it's a thing that actually works, for me at least, and I think it would work for anyone. I really think this is a thing that is applicable across the board, and if it's not working for you, it's actually going against the principle behind this. So the principle behind this idea is that you feel rushed to do things. Now, you sit down and you write, or you make music, or whatever you do, and I think it especially happens with writers because you're dealing with if you're trying to write a book, it's a big, huge, it's a difficult thing, and it's a long thing to do, right? It's just more long than difficult, I actually think. But you sit down and you want to be done with what you're doing, so you become impatient, and then you think about the end, and you think about everything, how it could be, and you kind of imagine that you have this finished product, but you don't have this finished product yet, and you become impatient. So since you become impatient, you feel frustrated, and maybe you have some anxiety coming up because of this. You're like, well, I'm not finished, and I should be finished, and I wish I were finished, etc. And what this does is it forces you, and it's kind of an indulgent thing, actually, a little bit, because when you start writing and you get into a groove of writing, what people usually do, and this is a bad habit to do, is they continue to write as long as they are on this high of writing. I've heard of a musician who stops whatever he's doing and he will make music because he suddenly gets the inspiration. But I think you really have to write without the inspiration. You have to develop a habit of writing no matter if you feel inspired or not, because if you write and you feel inspired, so you write, oh, I'm going to sit down, and suddenly you get this burst of ideas, so you write for 3 hours. Well, the reason why you're writing for 3 hours is because you're impatient, because you want to get all that out and you want to be done with it right away. This kind of goes back to, gosh, I just had a thought, but I can't remember what it was. Just gone. This, I believe that Stephen King this goes back to Ernest Hemingway's, and I think this is kind of what happened with him. He always said, oh, you should leave a little in the tank, essentially. I'm paraphrasing. That's not exactly what he said. But he said, never write everything you have to say, and he would, and I believe, from what I've read, he would end in the middle of sentences, and he would pick up in the middle of sentences, because then you have to finish it, and you kind of get into the groove of writing. This is kind of similar to that, but it's a little different, because this really goes into the psyche of people writing and the impatience and stuff like that. And the thing about it is people, if you're in that situation, and you're sitting down to a computer, or maybe you write longhand, or whatever you do, you sit down to that situation, and you feel really impatient, but you feel this writer's block coming on. Well, maybe this is the case, and I'm going to put this out there, and you can kind of judge for yourself whether it is going through your mind or not. You don't actually want to write. You actually want to have the book finished yet. And I think that's what's going on with most people. I believe that's what's going on with me when I run into this situation. I don't want to write. I just want to have whatever it is done, right? So since you want it done, you're impatient and you don't feel satisfied. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. But you can use that when you're running into writer's block. But I think it goes beyond that idea, and I think that you're actually developing something else. And this will get back to this idea of childhood. This will get back to this idea of anything you do can be applied with this. And to actually start talking about this principle behind it, we're going to actually talk about Dune a little bit. So you want to get this stuff done. If you've ever read Dune by Frank Herbert, at the beginning of that book, there's a really iconic phrase. It's fear is the mind killer. And I think what happens with people when they're writing too, and when they get writer's block, is they start to worry about what's going on. So when you worry, you're actually not as capable of thinking laterally, which is creative thinking. Like lateral thinking is creative thinking. So you aren't as capable of thinking laterally. Your brain kind of... think about your think about your thinking as a lens. And when you are not worried about anything, your lens is open, right? And then when you get worried or something like that, or you get scared, your lens closes because it's trying to protect you, right? It's trying to focus in on that thing that's scaring you, that's worrying you. I think I've talked about anxiety before, but anxiety, when somebody is anxious about something, or if somebody is afraid, and it's the same kind of feeling, it's just accentuated. When somebody is anxious or afraid about something, that idea, the thing that's worrying them, they keep on circling around that idea, and they have a hard time breaking from that idea. So that might actually be what's happening to you as well. And as I was saying before, this all connects back to another principle. So first off, try your best to slow down, but honestly, that is not going to work if I'm telling you and you're trying to slow down, etc., and so on. So you kind of need to know how to do it to a certain degree. What you're trying to reach out for in the end is, and I've talked about it before, is the idea of flow, where stuff is going by, you feel really capable of what you're doing, and time's going by quickly, and you're trying new things, and you're taking risks, but it's not too much of a risk. So you're kind of balanced on a razor's edge. There's this comfort level. So if you're too comfortable, it's too much. It's too good. Where you need to be is you need to be at the edge of your comfort level, right at the edge of like fear. So you're not anxious and you're not obsessed over something, but you're just a little tiny, like you're engaged, right? You're engaged and there is a little bit of danger, there is a little bit of risk, but you're still in a position where you're not going to freeze up. And this brings me to the idea of Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. So this all connects back together. And I think that, if you've never read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, it's an interesting book. I don't think it's going to change your life. I think it's not a prescription. It's not a philosophy that he prescribes in the book. If you don't know what the book is about, I'll quick tell you. So Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is essentially about the guy who wrote it. He talks about him and his son being on this motorcycle journey. And then he starts talking about motorcycles in depth, and the whole point of his book is to say, hey, when you're looking at something, and he's like, maybe when you're looking at a problem, don't focus so hard on the problem, right? I'm going to take his example, which is the motorcycle. That's kind of his picture that he uses, but he says, when you're looking at a motorcycle, just let your mind linger on the motorcycle. Let your mind linger on the engine. Let your mind linger on how that thing is put together. And you are kind of in this wonderment, right? If that's a word. You're kind of in this situation where you just imagine what's going on in the machine. So if you're looking at the piece, like you're looking at the outside, the most iconic motorcycle is probably a Harley Davidson at this time, but you're looking at the part of the engine. It's usually like chrome, and you start looking at it and you think about, and you just let your mind wander about that specific machine, and you start to wonder, what are those corrugated type looking things? What's this piece do? Why do they make it this shape? But at the same time, you're maybe not even always thinking it verbally. Maybe you're just allowing your mind to process it and go through it. And that's he uses that, and he essentially says, or what he talks about in the book is that you're actually taking your time. You're not just forcing yourself into a position where you're solving a problem. You're allowing your mind to wander through that process. And I think maintenance works well, because I think vehicle maintenance works well, because a lot of times with vehicle maintenance, most people don't know how to fix their own vehicles. And if they go on and they try to fix their own vehicles, they get really worried and they get really frustrated. What he's saying is just take a deep breath and just look at it. So it's actually something that you need to do. I believe that is, maybe you don't need to do it, but I think it's something that is really beneficial for you if you want to be creative. Instead of just taking in the world and you're walking through the world and you're interacting with people, you slow down enough to look at one little piece. And you look at that one little piece and you kind of observe it. You just observe it. You're taking your time. You're slowing down. And when you observe that piece, and you're able to understand it better, or you're able to process it on a different level, or maybe you'll have an insight. And honestly, like, the piece doesn't even have to be physical. Maybe you're like walking along and you see a blade of grass. You're like, I've never actually looked at a blade of grass before. which is kind of bizarre. Like there's all these things around us, and how many times have we actually taken the time to look at these things, right? There's some things that I've looked at a lot because I've just had to deal with them. One thing that most people have probably looked at a lot that I know is their phones, right? Or people have looked at TV screens a lot, or people have looked at computer screens a lot because I have to work on them. But you're not really seeing anything if you look at those because you're taking in things other people are creating for you. You're not taking in something that is has a lot of substance. They're all very utilitarian. They're all very pragmatic inventions. But yeah, so consider that. So just try it, I guess, and I think this will help you actually in your writing as well. You slow down, you look at something you haven't looked at before, and you just kind of stop. And you look at that thing, and you allow yourself to get bored, and you keep on looking at it, and you're like, oh, let's look at it from a different angle, and let's just see what it is. But again, if that's really boring to you, if that prospect is really boring to you, you don't have to look at a physical thing in this way. You can look at ideas in this way. You can look at principles in this way. If somebody says, if somebody makes a statement, you can look at the statement in this way. And what's going on in your brain is you're not going through this process of eliminating whether this statement is right, correct, or incorrect. You're just allowing this statement to kind of flow through you. And it's really hard to describe this. You're allowing this statement to flow through. You're allowing yourself to process this statement, understand what it says, and then see how it's applied to how it is applied in different areas in your work, in your life, but also in the world in general. So you're not trying to just think about your life, even though you only can think from your own perspective. And I think that's the same thing. It's this Zen. So Zen it's not a philosophy. It's more of a way of slowing down and looking at things, which I think it's valuable. I think it's useful. I think that everybody could be benefited by just slowing down and looking at things. Like I said, it's not really a belief system. But yeah, so this thing applies to the idea of writing. Now, let's go back to that idea of you sitting down in front of your computer, or sitting down and you have a piece of paper, because some of us actually write with a pen and paper, unlike the rest of you barbarians. So you sit down in front of your computer and you have writer's block. Or you're like, man, everything I'm writing is crap. Everything I'm writing is horrible. So what you do is what you would do in this situation is you would think about what you're writing about, and you would allow your mind to just wander, or you'd allow your mind to play essentially with that information. If it's a story, you allow your mind to kind of walk through the stories. And I've talked about this before, where instead of just trying to write something, you're actually trying to look into that story. If you could see that story from a passerby's perspective, how would you see it and what would you write about? In the same way, you can apply this to pretty much any other situation with writing. You can look at an idea. So if you have a thesis, if you're in college and you have a senior thesis, you can write that, and you can kind of play around with these ideas, and you can kind of let your mind linger on these ideas. And I really think that this is the type of thinking that allows people to think more deeply about things. The thing about it is that we've kind of reduced thinking. And I think it's a little sad. And so I think logic is extremely important. And I think evidence for your ideas are extremely important, but I don't think that that's the only type of thinking. And I think a lot of people think that's the only type of thinking. But honestly, this it's not reflection. Maybe you can call it reflection. When you allow your mind to just sit on an idea for a couple weeks or maybe even a month, you come to different conclusions about it. And maybe you don't have this perfect conclusion with all these different pieces of evidence, but maybe you understand the idea differently. It's kind of like a proverb or something like that. But with us, with this world, with teaching, within the teaching world, everybody says, oh, you have what you're saying and you always have to have evidence for it, which I think is very good. And I think you should have evidence for it. I think you should have a logical argument. I'm not against that. But at the same time, there's more thinking that can be done. Honestly, like if you try this yourself, and you can, if you go according to strict logic, like informal logic that you would use in a debate, let's just say, and all the logical fallacies that I present at the end of the if you're trying to avoid all the logical fallacies that I present at the end of the podcast episode, it's going to wear you out. But this type of thinking doesn't actually wear you out. It just allows you to process things and take them in and kind of chew on them, ruminate, like the word we had before. So what that requires is you to slow down. And that's the rule this week. Take your time. Take your time, because good writing, I think, in the end is play. That's a lot of words right there. But yeah, that's what I've got for you this week. Good writing is play. You can't play if you're forcing yourself to play. You can't play if you're rushing. You just have to allow yourself to process the information and not just walk through it. I always find myself running into this trap as well. I'm like, oh, what do I want to do? So I'm trying to do all this research, and I don't actually have these good ideas. But what I need to do, because I outline stuff, I outline all my stories. What I need to do is when I work on my story, I just need to relax, and I need to be ready to capture thoughts. That's another hard thing to describe. So this is something that I used to do a lot more, and this is something that I need to try. I'm trying to bring back into my life and trying to make myself more aware of. So, you have this idea of having a notebook everywhere, and you write down thoughts in your notebook. Well, I used to do that. I used to have thoughts, and I would write them down. I'd be like, oh, that's a kind of a cool thing. And the reason why I could do it is my eyes were open to the world, and my eyes were open to what's going on around me, and I could capture little moments in my mind's eye, or I would have like, that's an interesting idea. Do I have any to share with you right now? Yeah, sure. So one that I could share with you right now is that I was driving home, and I was driving to work one day, and I was driving through the hills, because around where my parents live, there's hills, and the sun was behind all this fog, and the sun looked like a big, huge quarter that's shining at the bottom of a pool. It was really cool. You could look. You probably should. I probably shouldn't have. I looked directly at the sun. I can't see now, but you could look directly at the sun, and it was this perfect circle. It was cool. I thought it was cool, and it's something I actually experienced. I'm like, wow, that's a really cool image. That would be a really cool image to convey to other people. That's a really cool thing to take from the world and put it into something. Another thing that I kind of captured is I have a friend, and I went to Europe with him, and when we were there, I think he was saying something about how he was really cold. He has no fat on his body. He's like pure muscle, and he was like, oh, I'm so cold, and I don't remember if he didn't actually say, oh, I'm so cold, but he's like, oh, I'm a summer child. It's cold here. And I'm like, oh, that idea of a summer child, like not that being born in the summer changes who you are, but we can take that and we can place it in a story and make it something bigger than just that statement. And that's something that I'm like, oh, that kind of sounds cool. That's kind of mythological. That's mystical in a way. I like that idea. So these are some things that I just noticed in my life and noticed in the world and noticed with people talking. And it's pretty much anything, which makes life a game, essentially. If you're looking for things to take and you're looking for things to put into a story or put into your writing at all times, it makes life a game. So slow down and just notice things around you, and slow down when you're writing, because you're not going to be able to do it as well if you don't. All right, logical fallacy of the week is argument by analogy. And what this is when you have an argument, you're making an argument for something, and you take an analogy of something else, and you say, oh, like it's just like this. So I don't have one off the top of my head. There's a lot of cases where people start talking about something, and I think this will help you understand. There's a lot of places where people start talking about something, so they're just trying to describe, like physics, right? And the person who they're talking to can't understand the physics. So the person's like, oh, is it like this? Is it like me throwing a basketball across the room? I don't know. And the person's like, well, yeah, it's kind of like that because of this, this, and this. But they're like, well, that's not the complete thing because the analogy breaks down. Well, if you're comparing two things, those two things are not the same thing, right? So they have different aspects to them, and the same logic cannot be applied to one situation as another sometimes, right? And there's certain cases where you could say, okay, this logic makes sense for both of these, but in some cases, the logic doesn't actually make sense. The situations or the things you're describing or the arguments you're arguing are too different, so you can't actually use an analogy and say, well, in this analogy, in this situation, this happened. Now, at that same time, in this same situation, just because someone's using an analogy doesn't automatically mean they're incorrect. You need to actually look at what they're talking about. You need to actually look at their argument to see if it's good or bad. And I think that an analogy can be used to reveal stuff, but it shouldn't be the complete basis of the argument. The argument should be able to stand by itself. All right, that's all I've got for you this week. As always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good. Merry Christmas.